millionaire. The plot it sort of gives a cover, it gives the authors a cover to satirize all sorts of characters, events, and organizations, pre-revolutionary, post-revolutionary, that they run into along the way. So you've got the action of the plot, and then these sort of series of satirical vignettes that go on, one of which Chad just read to us.
And how did this satire, which is pretty biting in places, and especially about the early Soviet Union, how is it that it came to be published? Was it serialized, or was it a novel from the beginning, or?
Well, it was a novel, but it was first serialized in 1931 in a popular magazine named 30 Days, so it was a monthly. And it was published in installments over the period of several months, and they were actually frantically writing and rewriting while it was being published. Among other things, completely reworking the ending of the novel from the original one. So the publication ended in December of 31. And interestingly, what came after that was not the book edition. What came after that in 32 were the two translations, the first American translation and the French translation. And the first American translation was billed as a book too funny to be published in Russia. There was a bit of a scandal with this, and the book clearly had trouble being published in the book form. And apparently, Maxim Gorky intervened personally. So finally, in 33, a year after the two translations, it was published in the book form.
You mentioned a little bit about the political climate. Can you say more about that? I mean, what was it like for writers who were writing at this time? I mean, it was still pretty early in the Soviet system, maybe only 15 or 20, only 15 years. So what was it like to be writing at that time, to be living then?
Well, 1931, and actually the novel was written between 29 and 31. 31 is was 14 years after the revolution, 11 years after the end of the Civil War. It was the transitional period still, or to be more precise, the end of the transitional period. On the one hand, the Soviet regime that we're all familiar with has not been fully established yet. On the other, the old regime was gone, so the scene was open for all kinds of con men, charlatans, etc., etc. Also, the so-called new economic policy was being wrapped up at the time, the policy that was started in the early 20s that allowed a limited private enterprise. So the novel, especially at the beginning, is full of small businesses of all sorts. And that was being replaced by forced industrialization, as exemplified by the first 5-year plan, which started in 28. And that is also reflected in the novel. You want to talk about
the writing situation? Yes, thinking about writers. For most of us, when we think of Russian literature, we think of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, maybe Turgenev, maybe Gogol. It's really the 19th century authors. And we think about that as the golden age of Russian literature. Well, the 20s were actually considered the silver age. And in parallel with this new economic policy, where there was quite a bit of freedom in the world of business, there was quite a bit of richness and experimentation in the arts. So the novel was published right at the end of this period, this very rich period. There were all sorts of different groups of authors, although the strongest group was probably the group of proletarian writers, RAP, who were closest to the government and censorship and all of that. And right before what we think of as, the totalitarian Soviet period, where censorship, when we think of the Soviet Union, we just think that censorship was very solid, it was, black and white. So the book came out just at the cusp between these two periods, and there was a lot of, sort of, change. I think it was in 1928, I believe, that the two heads of the Moscow Communist Party, the Moscow Writers Union and the Soviet Writers Union were ousted for trying to publish one of their works abroad rather than in Russia. And then by 1934, everything was sort of like very tight in terms of censorship. So I think it would have been difficult right around that sort of 1930 period. They would have had to have been very careful.
Yeah, some of the writers you mentioned, like Bulgakov and Olesia, they were sort of more absurdist, I guess I would say, but were other writers working in this sort of satirical style as well? Was this sort of a popular thing, or was it something that Ilf and Petrov kind of hit on, and they were sort of commanding the field, as it were?
There was a lot of satire back then.
Yeah.
Back then they were pretty much in the vein. But at the same time, they're essentially the only ones who stayed known and remained popular and well known. But there was a lot of it going on.
How did the two of them come together? I mean, what were they doing before they became writers? I mean, I think they had different sorts of jobs before they even came to journalism, yeah?
Well, the Golden Calf is their second novel in the last one. Their first one was The 12 Chairs that Chad mentioned before. And actually it's an interesting story about how they came to write it. They were both born in Odessa within 4 years of each other, a port city on the Black Sea, but they didn't know each other back then, or while they were living in Odessa. And in the early 20s, after the end of the Civil War, like many other young people, they came to Moscow. Ilf was in his early 20s, and Petrov was actually 20, and worked as a police investigator, police detective, something like that. And eventually, they both ended up working at the newspaper for railroad workers named The Whistle, or the Locomotive Whistle, where they started editing the letters from readers that were going to be published in the paper, just basically copy editing. And then they moved on to writing their own pieces, satirical pieces, usually nonfiction, just, satirical pieces about things that were happening in the country or on the railroads or whatever. Now, for some reason, that newspaper became a hotbed of literary talent. Yuri Lesher that you mentioned worked there. Bulgakov worked there too. They all knew each other. They all did things together. They collaborated every once in a while on their work for the newspaper. So that's how they met. Petrovs' older brother was already an established writer at the time. His name was Valentin Kataev. Petrov actually is a pen name. Petrov took it so that he didn't have the same name as an already established writer, his brother. Excuse me. So at some point, Kataev gave them the idea, the plot for the